And we had a human issue tonight. Dr. Bedient was called away to actually deal with a Army Corps of Engineers issue. And you know, the Army Corps of Engineers, you know, they're involved with this flooding around here. So he called and apologized, and he sent Andrew Wan here and he says, hey, I've been working with him for 10 years. He can do my stuff in his sleep as well as his own stuff in his sleep, so he's going to have a great presentation. And, you know, we all do our own presentations all the time at each other's, so I have a huge confidence factor on being able to get across the message of what is the story in Houston with all of our flooding over the years and what it's looking like. Then we're going to have Ryan Baer with Park. And so we start out with the kind of the macro with Houston and the flooding, and then Ryan's going to talk about a bit of the kind of where the water goes up in the woodlands, and then they just constructed a LEED Platinum facility and did some thoughtful considerations for rainwater and stormwater and all that, and at their project. And then Andrew Cobb here is, now we're going to get really down into the micro, because he kind of started the small business that is very concerned about recovery from Harvey. And so, you know, he's got kind of a really interesting solution on what do you do when you're drowned out and, you know, you have a bunch of stuff that's flooded and it went out on the curb. And, you know, what can we do better next time, thinking that, you know, this may not be the last flood that we see in Houston, Texas, okay? So that was kind of the whole idea. And I'm pretty pleased with that, and we'll just see how that. Meanwhile, my name is Steve Stelzer. I didn't even say that. I am the program director of the Green Building Resource Center downstairs, so feel free to take a look at that on your way out if you haven't never seen it. And then I do want to kind of call out in the audience, we have Sheila Blake, who late of the city, who actually hired me. This year 2019 is the 10th year anniversary of the Green Building Resource Center. So we opened up on Earth Day in 2009, and we're still here. So, you know, that's not too shabby. Then I did have a looping slideshow on. Let's do a quick advertisement for next month. Next month is going to be an away game. It is a LEED Platinum evening, and it's going to be July the 24th. Anyway, so the fourth Wednesday in July, and it's actually going to be downtown, so far away because we're downtown. There is a LEED Platinum high-rise that I'm very interested in going into because I don't think I've been in it. And so that'll be really nice to see and tour. And then we're going to have two other presentations of LEED Platinum facilities in the Houston area, and it's going to be very nice. And so I invite you all to that, but I'll be kind of just like one of the attendees and not particularly running that show. That's kind of the USGBC home game for them at one of our LEED Platinum facilities. So there we are. We're going to go ahead and start with Andrew.
Okay, good evening, everyone. I'm Andrew Wan. I'm a research scientist working with Dr. Phil Bedient, as Steve mentioned, at Rice University. Unfortunately, he's been called away for this all-important meeting with the U.S. Army Corps. So tonight I'll be presenting what he told me to present. It's basically anything related to flooding in Houston. So in putting together these presentation for tonight, it's sort of like a hodgepodge of a lot of different things, but I hope it will be informational as well as going to be useful and provide some useful resources for all of you. And in particular, I want to touch base on some of the important flood drivers of flooding in Houston, and also talk a little bit about the different flood mitigation approaches from a catchment scale, and mention briefly about neighborhood and local scale, which will be covered in more detail in Ryan's and Andrew's presentations, I believe. So here's an outline of my talk. So I will briefly go over some of the background and drivers of flooding in Houston. And then I'll talk a little bit about the FEMA floodplains and what they mean, the terminology, and also cover some flood mitigation measures, and then close with a particular case study that I believe is quite interesting in Brace Bayou, and then conclude. So, you're all here because you're interested in flooding, and this should come as no surprise. Flooding is a nationwide issue. For Texas especially, this is an extremely important issue. So the figure on the left is a heat map produced by NOAA that tracks the disaster cost per year due to flooding and severe storms from 1995 to 2018. What this is showing is that on an annual basis, Texas has incurred about $1 to $2 billion per year in flood and severe storm damages. In particular, Houston is one of the most flood-prone areas in the U.S. So some of the flood sources, along with their scale of impact, you can have local drainage issues, so surface or street level type ponding. You can also have flooding due to the interaction between riverine and local drainage issues. So for example, during a storm event, your channel can be, pretty high up or almost bank full, for example. And that might cause your local drainage or storm sewer system not being able to discharge your neighborhood runoff into the channel, and that causing the water to back up and flood your neighborhood. And then finally, you can also have catchment-wide flooding issues. And this is typically caused by, your major storms. So Harvey is a perfect example of this, where the sheer amount of rainfall and volume of water essentially overwhelms the entire channel throughout the entire county, basically. And on that note, you can have overbank flooding, and you might cause a dam breach or levee breach and flood the surrounding areas. All these point out to being that in Harris County, a lot of our existing stormwater management measures are insufficient to fully protect its residents from all these flood damages and flood risks. And there are several challenges that cause this. So some of these flood drivers are inherent in the region, but some of those are man-made. So some of the inherent flood driver, first of all, of course, is rainfall. So Houston, sitting in the Gulf Coast region, has a lot of rainfall. Not just a lot, but also very intense rainfall. So you might have heard that, in Houston, the 100-year rainfall, 100-year, 24-hour rainfall is about, 12 to 13 inches. But the recent updated statistics from NOAA has updated the 100-year, 24-hour rainfall to, look at the yellows and the orange contour maps. You see most of Harris County's watershed are between 16 to 18 inches of rainfall, up from the 12 to 13. So it's about a third of an increase. So this just exacerbates our flood risks in the entire region. The second inherent flood driver is soil type. So this is a soil map of Harris County. So on the northern half, you see that most of the soil type is, a loamy type or sandy type soil, which is great for infiltration. However, when you look at the bottom half or the southern half, where it prevents water to penetrate from the ground surface to the water table, for example.
What are the white spaces?
Those are water bodies.
Bayou, Ship Channel,
Yeah,
Fantasy
channel,
River.
there's our bayou.
Downtown is white.
or no data. And finally, Houston is very flat, so water just pulls around and go wherever it wants to go in no particular direction. But man-made flood driver. So urbanization is also a very important flood driver, especially in Houston. So on the left, there are two figures. The first is a sort of like a water balance of an undeveloped region, land, or watershed. On the right, you see the fully developed watershed. For an undeveloped watershed, you have a lot of pervious cover. So you'll have a lot more infiltration and natural processes like evapotranspiration. But on developed lands, you see that all those ground surfaces are now being covered by concrete. That obviously reduced infiltration substantially, and then in turn increase your surface runoff. Now, what does it mean in terms of hydrology? So all of these development affect your stream flow dramatically. So on the right figure, the dashed curve is the pre-development or undeveloped condition. So you see that the peak of the hydrograph, so hydrograph is flow versus time, the peak of the undeveloped curve is much lower, and it occurs much later than the developed curve, which is shown on the solid blue line curve.
I have a question.
Yes?
So you're showing us two drawings, 5% deep infiltration to 10 shallow, and then the other 25. From the previous map of clay and sand or loam, could there have been three drawings, one showing developed and then undeveloped clay and undeveloped loam and sand? Would they be different, or is that 25% hold for both the sand and the clay?
This is just generic, regardless of soil type. So just a schematic. Obviously, if you have like ground surface, if you have like clay type soil, even if it's undeveloped, you still have much less infiltration capacity as if you have undeveloped with like sandy sand. But the exact number is up in the air. This is just a schematic of a typical undeveloped versus a developed watershed. So to just show or to emphasize this point, I'm showing you a land use map and the impervious map of Harris County. And the source of this data is USGS. Comes from the National Land Cover Database. And this is 2016 data, which was just released last month. So we're already outdated by 3 years. But what this shows is that on the left, on the land use map, all the yellows, the orange, and the reds are developed. That means you have a lot of, concrete. And correspondingly, on the right, the blacker it is, the more impervious it is. So you can see all throughout Houston, all these black are basically impervious. That means water can't penetrate the ground regardless of what type of soil you have. It will just run off, and it, increase the velocity of the runoff as well because it's so smooth. So it's no wonder that this is the Harris County floodplain maps. This might be outdated as well, but the yellows are floodways, the blues are the 100-year floodplain, and the greens are the 500-year floodplain. So all throughout Harris County, we see we're very vulnerable to flooding. So I want to talk about the FEMA designated floodplains because personally, I'm a hydrologist, but a lot of my friends were confused about the whole concept of, what is the 100-year floodplain? Or what does it mean if you're outside of the 100-year floodplain, do you not flood? Or if you are in the 500-year floodplain, are you in risk of flooding? What's all that? So on the left, the figure is basically sort of a floodplain, the flood insurance rate map that you can pull online or from other sources. But that's typically what you'll see. You have like all these different lines, zone A's, zone X, and all those stuff. But the most important components of those are basically your floodways, your 100-year floodplain, and the 500-year floodplain. So if we rotate this map a little bit to plan view, 90 degrees, and then take a sectional cut of that section, we see that here's the floodway, here is the 100-year floodplain, and here's the 500-year floodplain. And I'll go over this a little bit. But essentially, what I want to define what floodway is. So floodway is basically the channel or water course or any adjacent land that behaves like a water course and to carry what they call a base flood. So base flood, according to FEMA, essentially is a 100-year storm or 100-year flood. But base flood, sometimes people are saying that it can also be a 500-year flood. So depending on who's speaking, I guess. But the most common definition agreed upon is that the base flood is basically the 100-year flood. So what is the 100-year floodplain? That's basically the land that's covered by water from the 100-year flood. And there's also a common misconception of the 100-year flood. So some people think that a 100-year flood means that you'll only get flooded once every 100 years. So that is completely incorrect. What that means is that you have a 1% chance of getting flooded in any given year. So 1 in 100 chance of getting flooded in any given year. It's not for 100 years, you only get flooded once. So the same concept applies to the 500-year floodplain and the 500-year flood. So now going back to this schematic, there's the BFEs. If you're looking at, building a new house in the 100-year floodplain, they require you to offset your finished floor elevation to a certain height. So I was just speaking to Phil about this, and he mentioned that Harris County has actually updated their requirements. And now what they require is that for new houses to be built, the finished floor elevation needs to be 2 feet above the 500-year BFEs or the elevations. And different cities have different requirements as well. For example, I think in Fort Bend County, I believe it's 1 foot above the 100-year BFEs instead of 500-year in Houston, in Harris County.
Isn't Houston, didn't they pass an ordinance to have it 3 feet above?
I think that depends on which flood zones you are in. So the 100-year flood zone is typically zone A or AE or different types of A's. But in certain areas, it might require you to go even higher, depending on the risk of flooding as they delineate it. Okay. So with all these flood problems, what are some of the flood mitigation options that are currently being pursued by the city, the county, or what can we do from like a neighborhood scale or even like an individual homeowner scale? So structural solutions, you can typically divide them into two. You have gray infrastructure or green infrastructure. So gray infrastructure is, as its name, it's mostly consisting of large-scale features. You can have like regional detention basins, you can have floodgates, flood reservoirs, you can have channel terracing and other modifications, or pump storage. On the green infrastructure side, so in the last, 15 years, since the late 90s, I believe, low impact development or green infrastructure has been extremely popular, especially in the Northeast. And a lot of people in Houston have been wondering whether green infrastructure would have any, benefit in terms of flood reduction. Because originally, I think they were primarily designed, or the purpose of the green infrastructure is to improve water quality. And we have a lot of studies and papers that comes up from those regions. However, in Houston, we still don't have a lot of long-term performance data as to how effective these features are in terms of being able to reduce inundation. So these green infrastructure features, for example, consist of rain gardens, your bioswales, infiltration strips, and also green roofs, which there are numerous scattered throughout Houston. So what has the Harris County Flood Control been doing in terms of protecting us from the next flood? So this is the bond program progress tracker that's available on their website. That's the link. I think it does a good job of providing a list of all the different existing and ongoing projects that they are pursuing. So different types of projects depending on which watershed it's in, what's the status of that project, and then they also provide links for more detailed descriptions of those projects. So I believe this is a very useful resource for you if you are concerned with your area. You can go to this website, type your address, and see what's been going on in terms of flood protection from the county. But then, what are the flood mitigation options from a neighborhood or a local scale, such as individual homeowners? I'm not going to go over this in detail because I believe either Ryan or Andrew will cover this more. But essentially, there are several options. You can elevate your house, cut and fill, or you can provide some local attention to address your neighborhoods or subdivisions flooding issues, improve site drainage, or improve flood conveyance. Another important component of this is that, we can build all these flood structures, but sometimes we put too much faith in the flood control structures itself, that it sort of provide a false sense of security, I believe, and in believing that all these structures will definitely prevent our house from flooding. And we have so many cases of that being proven wrong. Katrina, and then Alex Barker is a very, very close call. So what our group is passionate about is some of the non-structural solutions. And we believe a real-time flood warning system, whatever it is, can help save lives and also educate people about, what is the actual risk of flooding and what can you do given, real-time information. Help you reroute traffic or help you decide that, hey, it's raining, 2 inches per hour, just 1 mile north of where you're living. Maybe we should not go out for dinner or something. You might get trapped in the storm or things like that. So on the left, the Harris County provides its own real-time flood warning system. So it provides inundation estimates in real time based on stream gauge data that they have, which I find very, very useful. On the right, I just want to shamefully plug in our own system. So on the right, there's the RICE, a flood alert system. We work with the Texas Medical Center, I think after Allison in 2001, to build the system. It's updated every 5 minutes. So essentially, it provides a lot of real-time alert. So when it gets to a certain danger alert threshold, it automatically contacts the person in charge in TMC so that they can, kickstart their emergency operations. For example, like closing floodgates 1, 2, and 3, and then if it reaches a different alert level, then they have additional measures that they already put in place. So finally, I want to talk about Grace Bayou watershed, which I find very interesting. So Grace Bayou is located, just south of I-10, below Buffalo Bayou. The drainage area is about 128 square miles. The main channel is about 31 miles long and goes to Houston Ship Channel. And the most important thing to note is that it's virtually fully developed, and it's plagued by numerous storms in the last few decades, and especially in the last 5 years. So this is the major contributing problem to Grace's inundation problem. So in 1970s, well, starting from 1950s or 1960s, when Houston was rapidly developing, you see significant development occurring, from the east, just sprawling to the west side. But still, in 1970s, we still see a significant amount of green spaces. But in 2010, there's virtually none. So this contributes to the increased runoff, flood issue that we see. So these are the old 10-year and 100-year floodplains for Grace Bayou. I just want to point out this area is infamous Mireland because it was hammered by basically 3 storms in a row. The 2015 Memorial Day storm, again 2016, the Tex Day flood, and then finally Harvey. So triple whammy. Now, it's not that Grace Bayou doesn't have its flood protection. In fact, it has one of the, best, I believe, catchment-wide flood reduction or flood protection plan. What they call is Project Grace. So essentially what this project is, it's a $550 million federally funded project. It's a joint project by the Corps and the county. It began in early 2000s, still not yet finished or completed. It was supposed to be completed in 2014, which will be great to prevent, the Memorial Day storm damage. But even like after Tax Day, after Harvey, it's still not yet completed. And now they revised their completion date to 2021 at the earliest. The project was meant to fully contain the 100-year flood within the channel. So that was the original design purpose. It's a comprehensive plan that consists of, a lot of individual flood reduction plans, including, regional ponds, local ponds, channel improvements, as well as bridge modifications. However, as you can see, even being partially completed, so at the time in the 2015 Memorial Day storm, it was about 60 to 70% completed, and for Harvey it was 75 to 80% completed, but you still see, significant inundation, especially in Mireland. So we also looked at the damage claims and plotted against our model floodplains. And for the Memorial Day storm, we were able to capture that really well. Most of the damage occurred in Mireland, so we were able to capture about 83% of those. But interestingly, for Harvey, even though the floodplain, the model floodplain, is significantly larger, the amount of claims that we capture are less. Only about 60%, 65% of the claims captured. And that's because a lot of those claims occur outside of the riverine floodplain, which means that, aside from the channel overtopping that floods the surrounding areas, you might have local drainage issues, local ponding issues that creates additional flooding. So even if the county revises its riverine floodplain that they publish, it might still underestimate the true flood risk of the area. So I don't want to be all doom and gloom, but essentially Houston has a huge flooding issues because of numerous flood drivers. So they're inherent, which we can't really do anything about, but those man-made we can perhaps address. And from our case study and working with different watersheds, we also realized that there's no single solution that can eliminate Houston's flooding problem. And because of that, a concerted effort from different disciplines will be required to, actually help or to address Houston's flooding problem. So that's it. Here are some useful links that I believe will provide some additional resources. I particularly would like to note the Greater Houston Flood Mitigation Consortium. A lot of my figures that I've shown in this presentation, including the floodplain terminology and all those, are detailed, described in detail in separate sort of like a pamphlets or brochures that you can print out, and that's available in that website. So that's it, and here's my contact info. Thank you for listening.
All right, thank you, Juan. Any questions for Andrew while changing the?
Yeah, just towards the greenscaping, is there any preliminary data showing, what sort of, effect there is from that? I would imagine in Houston, since we get it so quickly and so fast, maybe it doesn't have the same impact that it would in the Northeast.
Actually, my major component of my PhD thesis is looking at the impacts of low impact development features to reduce flooding from a watershed wide basis. So what we found was that number one, infiltration based features in downtown Houston doesn't work very well because of clay soils and all that. However, the kicker is the intensity of the storm. Houston has frequent flashy type storms that gets super intense at a short amount of time, drops like 1.5 to 2 inches per hour, sometimes even like in a matter of like 15 or 30 minutes. And that caused your feature, the soils, to be saturated really fast. And after that period, then it's as if the feature is not there in the first place. So that's the difficulty. But what I found was that if you are talking about your smaller storms, sort of like a 1 to 2 inches over a number of hours, then yeah, that helps a lot. But for the fleshy type storms or the bigger type storms, it's just it's too intense, or the magnitude is too big for it to have any meaningful impact in terms of flood reduction.
Okay.
All right, so Ryan, take it away.
Is this just a remote or is it a laser pointer?
No, that's going to turn off the projector.
Okay,
So
well,
it's the arrows on the.
okay, gotcha.
Okay.
All right, so I'm Ryan Baird. I'm a research associate at HARC, which is the Houston Advanced Research Center. So I have a focus there on hydrology and watersheds, but I have a lot of other interests, including natural resource management and other applications as well. So tonight I'm going to talk a little bit about optimizing the built natural environment for flood resistance, and that was a fantastic introduction there with background content. Very well planned by Steve. So as I mentioned, HARC stands for the Houston Advanced Research Center. So we're a nonprofit research institute. We have 3 different programmatic areas of research interest. Those are air, energy, and water. And all of those research projects that occur within those kind of within the context of resilience and sustainability, so that's our focus. And as Steve mentioned, we just opened a new LEED Platinum facility about 2 years ago now. So we're quite proud of the space, and I know my energy team would be after me if I didn't mention we actually recently just added an additional 77 kilowatts of solar capacity to the roof. So we're actually on track to be one of the first or only net zero commercial buildings in the state of Texas. So we're tracking that data right now, and that should be wrapped up by the end of this year. So quite happy with how the progression is building. So to get into a little bit more, I did want to talk about a general overview of low impact development. So basically, low impact development presents or represents an alternative design strategy to conventional site development. There's 3 core tenets of LID, or low impact development, and that's the preservation of vegetation or pre-existing habitat that can be found on site, the utilization or the incorporation of the pre-existing site hydrology and surface water flow, and then the limit of overall impervious cover that's incorporated into the site design. So it's really the 3 main factors behind LID. But LID in and of itself is a series of different practices that incorporate both engineered and nature-based design elements into the site. So I did want to point out, there's some examples here that I've been kind of collecting some of my travels around the country and things like that, but the top on your left there is actually in Albuquerque. It's a very arid environment, and that is a convention or hotel parking lot that has been retrofitted with a LID practice to capture that first 1 inch of rainfall coming onto the parking lot and treat it through this file swale in the center island median here. You can see the curb cutouts to allow that inflow of water during a storm event. So this one here is actually more of a local example. There's a new development going in just north of Conroe. It's called the Woodland Hills. And it's actually a pretty interesting example of kind of a master plan community that focuses on some of the LID practices. One, they are preserving a lot of the habitat that's found on site. And this example here is a center island median and a roadway actually. And you can see that that's a depressional area. So that's designed to capture a lot of the runoff and during rain events that falls onto the road surface. And of course you can see that they've incorporated native vegetation at Turk's Cap. There's some beautyberry there and the Yukon as well. And that community is being designed with open stormwater vegetative swales as well to convey their stormwater. It's on the far side of this roadway here. So that's the open vegetated system for stormwater conveyance. So the other 2 examples are structural practices. In the middle there we have a permeable pavement parking lot. So instead of having that impervious cover, that allows the rainfall to infiltrate to the ground. And then on the end there is a practice actually at A&M. I know I saw some rings in here, but that's on the A&M campus. It has a catchment surface and then a series of rainwater cisterns beneath that to harvest that rainwater and then store it on site. And they actually reuse that on site. They have some teaching gardens that they just opened up as far as irrigation of some of the landscapes they have out there. So that's just some different examples of different practices that could be incorporated on site. But the overall goal of all of these practices is to break up the stormwater management instead of utilizing the detention basin. But breaking up those practices, distributing them through the site, and then managing that stormwater on site prior to it running off or being routed to a detention basin. So this is really a great illustrative example, and it's one of my favorites. But on the far side there, of course, is a natural ecosystem, and that's a cypress tupelo wetland over here in the Big Thicket Nature Preserve. And then this is an example of a low-impact development practice not too far here off Bagley Street in Midtown. So obviously at surface value here, you can see the vegetative communities are very similar. You have the cypress, the dwarf palmetto, and some of these understory shrubs that are incorporated, obviously because they're designed or adapted to what environments. But some of the other interesting features you can see is that during a rainfall event, basically both of these systems are doing the same thing as far as serving as catchments or depressional areas that capture that storm water. Of course, in the more of the nature-based system that rainwater is coming off of the land surface or the land cover, but here that rainwater is allowed to inflow into the bioretention cell through these curb cutouts, both on the sidewalk side and the street side. So what that does then is allow that water to be processed by some of these nature-based or hydrological cycle principles. The 3 core and most important ones are going to be your evaporation, transpiration, and then infiltration. So the idea behind the low-impact development practices is that they can not only control stormwater, but also dissipate it to reduce the volume before that volume continues on to the, in this case, the stormwater system, or of course in the natural system to the waterways and surface water sources. And you can see here in the bioretention cells, these weirs were incorporated to help control the depth of the water, as well as the water flow, which allows more time to slow that water down for some of those fundamental principles to occur and process that stormwater. So then this one kind of says that 46,000 gallons of water treated. Certainly hope it's more than that by this point. I'm not exactly sure what time period that covers, but just to give you an idea. So it's kind of a general overview, but now I'm going to talk a little bit more about our site design and our campus. But a little bit of background on that. We are located up north in the Woodlands, about 30 miles from here. So you can see our campus here. We have about a 3.5 acre property. It was mixed forested pine and hardwood native natural habitat there. So the first thing you notice, of course, is how we are squarely located outside of the 100 and 500 year floodplains. But unfortunately, we have 2 of our main waterways, Bear Branch and Upper Bear Branch, that are impaired for having high levels of bacteria for as far as contamination towards public health. So that was a big design consideration to not increase the amount of bacteria or loadings, stormwater pollutant loadings that are flowing from our site into these waterways. So the whole principle behind our site, as you kind of saw in some of those earlier examples, is to design with nature. And the way we were able to incorporate that is actually before any construction began, we had a habitat assessment performed on the site to look at all the different vegetation classifications. That assessment identified 54 different plant species. Most of those were native. There was a few invasives that we're working to eradicate from the site. But based off that habitat assessment, we established 3 different ecological exclusion areas. You can see on the map. So you have A, B, and C. And those areas were actually the areas of highest biodiversity or most kind of healthiest native habitat and vegetation. So based off the delineation of those areas, and the habitat assessment actually guided the layout for our building footprint in the site. So you can see that the building kind of on the bottom of the picture here was located between exclusion area B and C, and then the parking lot actually curves around exclusion area B and A to limit that amount of disturbance we're having on the valued habitat as we saw it. So based on incorporating some of those design elements, we're able to preserve about 70% of the site as undisturbed habitat, forested land covered. So there's also some other components of the site that kind of cohesively work together as a system to manage our stormwater. Kind of the first and foremost, as we saw in the earlier presentation, with the issue of impervious cover, which can increase runoff and the volume rate of stormwater. We wanted to make sure to reduce impervious cover on site as much as possible. The main really impervious features are the building roof, the roof itself, and then the parking lot, of course. But we didn't incorporate permeable walkways, and then try to reduce the amount of concrete needed. You see the center island prairie feature in the middle of the parking lot there. That serves as a kind of a catchment and actually modeled that vegetative community enough like a blackland prairie. So a lot of the species you'll see in a prairie environment incorporated into that area right there. So we also incorporated a curbless parking lot that doesn't restrict runoff and flows coming off the parking lot. We have restored landscaping on site, so basically any of the areas that were disturbed during construction, we went ahead and incorporated, in a lot of cases, site-specific vegetation that was already there, if not site-specific vegetation from other areas of the county into the site design. So we're able to restore, essentially use some of the landscaping beds in an untraditional way to kind of restore some of that habitat, repair some of the disturbance that was done during construction. And then the main site feature is the bioswale, which I'll get into a little bit more here in a second. But I have the rainwater cistern asterisk there because we're currently looking for some grant opportunities to install a couple of rainwater harvesting systems on the downspouts of our building. And I'll kind of talk about that here in a little bit. But to give you an idea, the surface area of the building is about 10,000 square feet. So for a 1-inch rain event, we'd actually have the ability to collect about 6,000 gallons of rain coming off that catchment surface and incorporate that into the rainwater harvesting system. So we're looking for hopefully a couple of different systems, maybe about 10,000 gallons in capacity between them to help capture that rainwater and store it as well. So as far as the sustainable stormwater management goes, those other pieces are all kind of components of that cohesively work together as a system. But sort of the backbone of the system is the bioswale, and you can see it on this figure here. It actually begins in the rear of the building and then circles part of the parking lot and makes its way off to the side of the property on the far end there. But actually the roof has a slope angle to it, and there's 2 downspouts on each of those rear corners, coupled with a gutter system. So any of the rainfall that occurs on the building itself is channeled and released directly into the bioswale via that gutter system. So we're capturing all that rainfall and conveying it off-site, but I did want to point out, I did some kind of cursory analysis on the velocity and flow through the bioswale. For a typical rain event right now, we're about like 1.8 feet per second, which is a little bit faster than I'd like to be. Ideally, you want to angle in the 1 lows to slow that water down, and then it gives it a little more time to treat that water and reduce the volume of water before it makes its way offsite. But of course, the bioswale incorporates different native vegetation, wetland vegetation, and things like that to help with pollutant processing and slow that stormwater that's being routed offsite. So I also want to point it out, though, the main component of really the stormwater management on-site is these areas, these kind of mass areas of preserved habitat and vegetation. Thanks to the hydrologic cycle, they're really processing a lot of that rainfall, intercepting a lot of that rainfall before it even reaches the ground. So you have a rain event, a good portion of the rainfall is actually stored in the canopy as intercept, and then a portion of that remaining rainfall will either occur as throughfall, so make it through the system down to the ground, or as trunk flow to the ground. So really we're capturing a lot of the rainfall before it even reaches the ground, and then the remaining kind of water budget or rainfall budget that does reach the ground can be treated through either vegetative uptake, so transpiration is pulled from the soils in the ground and released back to the atmosphere, or if there's saturated conditions or high amount of rainfall, there's a portion of that that could occur as runoff. But really for most of your storm events, we're able to capture and process that rainfall on site without increasing the volume of rain that leaves the site. So, and then I did want to point out too, a lot of the parking lot flow, especially from this kind of portion of the parking lot down on the southern side there, actually flows off the parking lot, and there's a couple of what I call micro tributaries that come off the parking lot and join into the bioswale. So we're capturing that runoff from the parking lot as well. So here we have like kind of the overall, the results of that design process and using the nature-based design elements, but really integrate kind of the built environment to have a much more robust and functioning system on-site rather than just sacrificing kind of a lot of those ecological habitats and the hydrologic, cycle of benefits. If we just came in and developed the whole site as impervious cover and didn't pay attention to some of these ecological and hydrological factors. So it's my hope, I'm a scientist as well, so I love data. So I'm definitely hoping to incorporate some smart site technology. So I'm looking for some grant opportunities to incorporate some data loggers and also a weather station on site. So I'd like to get some water level and water temperature probes into the bioswale, and then some soil moisture probes and some leaf wetness meters. And a lot of those components then can be monitored in real time. So as we're having rainfall We could route those metrics real time to something like this dashboard that you see here. That way we can track the performance and the processes that are occurring within the bioswale in real time. And that goes back to that lack of information a lot of times that we come across in the region with some of these low impact development sustainable design practices. So it's definitely a goal of mine to be able to start closing some of those gaps and providing the information as a resource to the region. So that was kind of an example of how we developed at the site scale, but of course there's a lot of...
Yeah, Ryan, question on the, before you get into this
Sure.
kind of more macro thing, do you have any irrigation?
There is no external irrigation.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then my question is gonna be, if you get the rain tanks, what's your intention to do something with the harvested rainwater?
Yeah, that's a great point. So our idea so far, we use all native vegetation on site, so we typically don't have to irrigate or supplement the water. But there are times, peak summer, July, August, September, you definitely notice some hindrance to the native plants. Even would benefit from some supplemental irrigation. So the idea was to maybe use part of it in times of excess heat. Drought conditions, if we have a long-term drought where they're not having any rain events for a significant amount of time, should be utilized then. But we're also actually thinking about maybe working on a partnership. There's a system or a administrative building of the Lone Star College campus that's just on the other side of our property. And we actually used to lease our office space from them until we moved to the new site. But trying to develop maybe a partnership where they might be able to use some of that water to offset some of their irrigation requirements on their site too.
So if you actually do a water balance here, it doesn't really make sense to do a cistern like that if you're trying to do for vegetation. Where it might make sense is if you started using it for things like flushing toilets.
That's what I was asking.
Yeah, and too, it's more for us, it's to capture, kind of contributing to the volume reduction of the stormwater, but also it's an educational opportunity for us to have something like that on site where we can talk about it and use it as outreach material so that we see benefits on that end as well. Okay, yeah, so the Woodlands, Texas, I don't know if anyone's been up that way before. I know it's kind of the Northern Territories compared to where we are now, but so anyway, the idea behind the Woodlands, Texas was to design and develop a holistic, kind of comprehensive community really that was based on ecological and hydrological design principles. So the idea came from George P. Mitchell back in the early 1970s, and he was really the driving force behind the development and design of this community. There was a book released actually in 1969 called Design with Nature by Ian McCard. And he's kind of one of the grandfathers or principal founders of landscape architecture and sustainable planning at the community level in the country. So Mr. Mitchell had read that book and was quite inspired by that. And he was also involved with and aware of a lot of different social and environmental issues that were ongoing around the country at that time. So he wanted to develop kind of an alternative community to mitigate against some of those environmental and social issues and provide this kind of holistic community where there's walking paths and each neighborhood has job opportunities and all those kind of things as well. So the idea, basically once George Mitchell read that Design with Nature book, he contacted Ian McCard and brought him out to Texas to be the lead on his planning process for the design of the Woodlands. So actually Ian McCard did a pretty impressive study, especially for the time. This was 50 years ago, but he conducted a series of reports looking at everything from the geology to the ecology to the vegetation to the surface and groundwater hydrology to the climatology. They looked at wildlife trails, all those different aspects that was at that time an undeveloped tract of land or property 30 minutes north of Houston to come up with this master plan for this community. And that was really contingent on three basic design principles. One, to utilize the pre-existing surface water hydrology and use open surface drainage instead of conventional drainage systems to manage the stormwater. They also have the idea to preserve those permeable soils or areas that allow for that high infiltration to capture the stormwater. So they wanted to protect those as green space or golf courses or parks and things like that and kind of offset them from development. And of course, the biggest, especially if you ever visited up there, is that the preservation of the forest and land cover can be kind of frustrating if you're trying to find a business, because a lot of times, they'll be shielded behind the trees and things like that. At the end of the day, it's really a significant design feature of the community. So they went through all that planning process, and I just wanted to throw some examples out here. At the top there is some of the flood plans and the surface water hydrology for the Houston-Dallaston region. The middle depiction here is hydrologic soils classifications. So actually that kind of pink band right across the middle of the northern section there are some of your higher infiltration soils. And then the bottom is kind of a generic land cover showing your vegetation, the green, still the green areas up to the north, and gray being the developed of the Houston area. So it's kind of some of the factors they considered in the site design and planning process. But I do want to dive a little bit more into the details. We kind of talked about some of the neighborhood scale developments. On the right side here is an example of a neighborhood from the Woodlands area. And then on the left side is an example from not too far south of the Woodlands, actually in the Spring area. So two different neighborhoods designed and developed in two completely different manners. The Spring area being much more conventional based design and development, and the Woodlands, again, with that nature-based design. So is there any and I guess I should mention this is infrared imagery. So the denser vegetation you can see as kind of the brighter red, and then the pink is very light, kind of not very dense vegetation. So is there any landscape features that stick out to anyone right off the bat?
Retention pond.
All right. Yeah, so that's the first thing that I would notice in the area. Is this extremely large scale retention pond, especially in comparison size to the development. But basically, since that natural hydrologic cycle was basically disrupted when they developed the site, we're just going to assume there was some pre-existing vegetation there, but that's all been removed. They at best they got maybe 1 live oak per yard. You can see a few of those in there. So there's not much vegetation on site any longer to intercept that rainfall, which is really one of the principal links in the hydrologic cycle. So what's that done? And they also probably regraded and rerouted a lot of the site hydrology to drain to that detention basin. So what's that done is kind of disrupted the hydrologic cycle significantly from pre-development conditions. And when rainfalls occurs, you're going to get a lot of increased runoff from these impervious areas, the houses and the parking lots, or the driveways and the roadways, being channeled to that detention basin. So here in the Woodlands, though, a lot of the green corridors, especially along some of the major thoroughfares, were preserved, the green space. And you can see, all throughout dispersed throughout the neighborhoods, is that preserved green corridor or habitat. The vegetation can be covered. So on top of that, they utilized the pre-existing or the natural hydrology and the surface water flow in the area, and then they manage their stormwater through open vegetated swales. All of that essentially has benefits down the line as far as reducing the volume of stormwater and peak flows coming off of the areas. So I did want to mention, that was the initial design and development behind the Woodlands, but it has changed hands a couple of times since that point. There's 8 different kind of communities or neighborhoods, and the first 2, really the main 2 developed based on most of the initial planning process. Kind of as time went on, but some of the different areas of communities deviated that for some ways and some less so. But anyway, that's kind of the idea behind it, is that you have these intact areas that allow the hydrologic cycle to process, reduce the flood impacts and stormwater flows coming off the site where you have this conventional developed community area. It's really not providing a whole lot of benefits as far as, especially in relation to stormwater pollutant processing. You want new vegetation in the detention basin to facilitate, remediation or uptake of pollutants or anything of that nature. And really, detention basins by and large are usually designed to withhold rain for a short period temporarily, typically 24 to 48 hours, to which point it's kind of slowly released off-site anyway. So you're not getting a whole lot of stormwater volume reduction coming out from those areas. So that's the book there that I had mentioned by Amy McCard. And There was a paper that came out recently that kind of had that quote. I thought it was quite striking that it's ecological wisdom applied in the woodlands is real and permanent good. There's been a series of studies comparing the woodlands, not only watersheds within the woodlands to each other that were developed under different practices, but also comparing watersheds in the woodlands to watersheds in Houston that were developed conventionally or have a lot more impervious cover instead of an intact native habitat and things of that nature. So, I have to take my word for it as far as the results go, but these are some from the publications, basically overall just saying that the communities, sustainable communities design these ecological and hydrological principles can play a factor in reducing peak flow as well as the volume of runoff coming off some of these sites. And then, I want to make sure to point this out as well. For our organization, our projects typically occur, we would consider the Houston-Galveston region as our study area, which we see here. So our site in the woodlands, is located, of course, upstream in this area, and that's hydrologically connected to Bear Branch, Panther Branch, and Spring Creek, ultimately connecting to Lake Houston during Galveston Bay. So I just wanted to point out that, really the region is an interconnected system of hydrology. So, what happens in these upland areas and these upstream areas definitely is going to affect these downstream areas as well. Definitely I think incorporating some of these practices in the northern part of the region, or the upper part of the region, especially down in northern Harris County there as well, can help to kind of reduce some of these flood impacts downstream. So that's all I had. Just wanted to wrap it up, but basically I want to leave it with the message that a lot of times when I focus on flood resistance as buildings or land cover or sites within the floodplains, the upland sites and the other areas also play a large part in flood reduction and flood mitigation potentially as well. So it's not kind of leave them off to the side, but also incorporate that. Kind of think of things from a systems perspective to ultimately have the outcome that we're seeking. But as Andrew said as well, we're not advocating for necessarily purely nature-based and preservation of habitat over everything else, but it's really about the incorporation and integration of some of these green practices with the gray practices to have the most desirable outcome.
Thank you. Any questions for Ryan real quick?
Here you go.
Oh, yes.
I was just going to say that if you're looking for a weather station, that maybe you can get one in collaboration with Lone Star College, or it's amazing how many private citizens have pretty sophisticated weather stations
Yes.
that you could just tap into and use their data.
Yes. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, we could do, I know like Weather Underground and things like that, has some of those locations. Yes.
Okay, take it away, Andrew.
Okay, these are great, I learned a lot. This is cool, yeah, to start big and then we can get down to a more granular scale. I think, with Andrew's presentation, if we're looking at the flood mitigation things that are already in place and are being built, sometimes they fail, or sometimes there's just 50 inches in 4 days and there's only so much that you can do. And then in the case of the woodlands, is if yes, there is a master plan community and you can integrate with green infrastructure, like surely that's ideal. But what if the neighborhood you're working in is the result of redlining and was like, developed in a very specific way for very specific people, and those people didn't have much say in how their neighborhood came out. So, some friends and I started a nonprofit during Hurricane Harvey called West Street Recovery. It just started with a couple of bikes and a kayak, and just during the storm, as many people did during Houston, just got out there and just, got on Facebook and got on all the little apps and just, found people that were stuck in their homes, elderly or children, and Houston did a pretty amazing job getting people out. Could have been even better, but I thought it was pretty amazing to see so many residents showing up for their neighbors. And so we did that, but we just carried on through that. We carried on through the mucking and gutting phase, trying to clean up people's homes, and kept getting drawn back to this same neighborhoods up in Northeast Houston, parts of Cashmere Gardens, parts of Fifth Ward, Trinity Gardens, Lakewood, where the original Lakewood Church was. That's actually where we do most of our work now. And during that time, we partnered with groups like Black Lives Matter and National Black United Front that were doing really strong volunteer efforts to clean out homes. And once those efforts started to dwindle, we started to pick up our pace. And eventually one of the residents who we had helped clean out their home taught us how to hang sheetrock, taught us how to hang insulation, how to mud, how to take and float. And so we took that skill and just took it to the next house and took people, Raul has now worked on almost every house with me since then. And we've touched 50 homes. So that's been really cool, and we've worked with other residents as well in different capacities. Okay. So why resilience? I mean, you can probably have all your own reasons, and we just saw a lot of really good reasons. Some of the specifics in the neighborhood in which our group is working in are that I saw an MIT presentation not long after Harvey that said that within 25 years there was just like really likely that we'd get another Harvey-sized rain event. I'd have to go find out. I think that was like an RDA lecture or something. I got to go find the source of that, but that stat definitely stuck out to me. We're working in neighborhoods where average median income is anywhere from $15,000 to $28,000, and average homes, we've rebuilt homes that are market rate at $22,000 and maybe up to $48,000. So I grew up in Meyer Park, Meyerland, where it's vastly different scale, right? I like to talk about my dentist, who is really cool and does good dental work. Lives over in Meyerland and has flooded through all of those storms and has collected $1.2 million from flood insurance. I work with families that flooded during Allison, Harvey, some in between, but most just those two rain events, and they maybe collected $8,000 from FEMA in Harvey, and then maybe nothing or a similar amount during Allison. So under $20,000 for two damages. They're not paying into flood insurance, but to me it's like, wow, look at the scale of that, and look at how we've gotten it down to where we can spend $25,000 to $30,000 and not only fix flood damage, but pretty much retrofit the house, put a new roof, new siding, tile floor. We can bring that home up to code and be much more livable, much more secure and safe and that type of thing. So it's interesting to me to see where dollars could go and what they could do. Lakewood's also right next to Mount Houston. The landfill is right there. So that was another dramatic thing for me to see that as we saw those piles of trash in front of people's yards during the storm, a lot of that was going right around the corner. So for me and for these residents, there's a lot of incentive to lower the amount of waste that's going to that landfill, because the more that goes there, the more it gets into their soil and waterways that are right around there. I teach classes at urban farms like Think It Trace for Bliss, and I love talking to the kids and being like, where does trash go? And they're like, it goes in the trash. And I was like, well, where does that go? It's like, well, it goes to the dump. And I'm like, where's the dump? And they're like, I don't know. I was like, is it in Houston? They're like, no. I'm like, it is. And I'm like, do people live near the dump? And they're like, no way, that'd be terrible. I'm like, well, let's go out to Lakewood and you can see that that's a real thing. And for me, having grown up, born and raised in Houston, I spent very little time in that part of town other than my brother's actually here. Our dad loved trains, so we'd go out to Inglewood Yard and look at the trains, but other than that, I had no idea what was up in that area. So anyhow, our group, I thought we did pretty decent to, through our work, we're a lot about building relationships with the families that we work with, and I thought we did good in the first, it's coming up on 2 years, so maybe the first year to 18 months, we did a lot of observation. You know, what happened during the mucking phase? What was the good part of that? What was the bad part of that? What does the rebuilding phase look like? We started to identify pain points. And so through that process, we came up with some strategies that could help in the event of families that are in Cashmere Gardens or in Lakewood that are very likely to flood again. What are some low-tech, low-cost, attractive solutions that can be implemented to make their recovery process a little bit faster the next time? And so this is the list, and we'll go through some of these. We came up with some flood-proof cabinets that are mostly metal construction. We came up with what we're calling a muck-ready wall, but FEMA actually has a pretty similar thing, and we'll show some photos of them, make a lot more sense. We do things like use fabric curtains instead of composite doors whenever we can. Elevating outlets so that if floodwater comes in, the outlet doesn't have to be replaced, the wiring doesn't have to be replaced, and there's less chance of electrocution, all types of things. Ceramic tile floors, and then seal the floors so that, again, if they flood, they can just be cleaned and not have to be replaced. We do rain gardens, which have been spoken about a few times. That's been a pretty fun and engaging thing. And then we just, in general, try to, repair the roofs and update the plumbing and get that stuff just into into better shape so that during the next storm they can put things back together a little faster. So what are some of the problems we saw during our time in the neighborhood? A really common one, 6 months, 12 months, 15 months after, were that people didn't have their kitchens back together. I've eaten countless meals in Petra's kitchen, and during the storm, right after the storm, she lived in a tent outside and just cooked on a little stove. And as many as 12 months after, she was still cooking on this little stove because she wanted her kitchen back how it was, or at least similar. And eventually, some money came in that we could put that kitchen back together, but it's the off-the-shelf composite material that was the price point which we could afford to put in there, and it's already falling apart at the seams. Luckily, Raul's there with his little nail gun, just like piecing it back together all the time. But it's certainly not going to last another storm, and may not last just general wear and tear. This is a photo of one of those composite kitchen cabinets. I'm not sure how many of y'all are familiar with the FEMA PREPS program that came into a lot of these middle or low income neighborhoods and touched a lot of families really fast. They did, I don't know what the number, 12,000 homes really fast. And if people signed an agreement that, people could sign an agreement that they would move out of their FEMA hotel if FEMA would come to their house and put exterior walls up with no paint, no anything, just like unfinished sheetrock, no mud. They would do 8 feet of kitchen cabinets. They put together 1 bathroom, and I think that was it. They want to do any mold remediation. They called it a temporary solution, so they didn't, and there's so many details that make it really crazy what they did. But one example of what they did was, they put in these 8 feet of cabinets. They did a little shoddy work on the plumbing under the sink. It starts to leak, and 3 months after installation, there's mold on the cabinet. It's breaking down. It's spreading to the wall. It's going from the wall and spreading around. And it's like, wow, well, that was interesting. I mean, it got the family back in, and it's like, is indeed a temporary solution. But what are some better ways in which we could use that money? And just for comparison, I estimate that it's about $100 per linear foot, or we're just talking lower cabinets with the composite counter on top of that, like the laminate on top and stuff. So we did some talking and looking around and stuff, and I was actually at a bike shop in Colorado and saw something like this, and I was like, this is what we've been talking about, which is to do steel tubing for kitchen cabinets. So this is one of the last things that comes back in. It's kind of the centerpiece, the heart of the house. A lot of families we work with cook a lot. It gets a ton of use. How do we make that resilient but still attractive? That was always the big thing. You know, we don't want it to look like a commercial kitchen, because you could just hose that down, but it doesn't look that great. So this is Johnny, one of our all-star contractors that we work with. He had a welder who put this one together as our first attempt at it, and we used a decent amount of wood on this iteration. You can see that under construction. You can see we used pretty nice cabinet grade plywood, but as I saw a presentation here put on by Steve, FEMA has a long list of all the materials that are floodproof and which are not, and most forms of plywood are not floodproof. You'd have to seal them in some way or get marine grade. So even this first iteration wasn't a perfect go at it, but our thought was, okay, she got, I think, 18 inches. So it's like, if she gets, maybe there's a smaller flood or a mid-grade flood, and you're just looking about replacing those bottom few shelves, but the sink itself would still be in shape, and the drawers would still be usable. So there's the drawers getting attached to the tubing. Here's a few bit of details on it. It has adjustable feet, so if the floor isn't level, you just kind of screw it and unscrew it. Try to use materials that are pretty easy to find. And that first iteration came out to about $150 per linear foot. Here's the sink going in. And then that's close to the final. We put some, I don't have a good photo with the doorknobs on it. Yeah, this family was really happy with this solution. We ended up using tile for the countertop, and then we put, you can notice that we left a lot of it open again so that there wasn't too much wood that had to be tossed. We did put wood in to cover the plumbing, but it was a pretty bare bones solution. It was our first run at it, and the family was very enthusiastic about it. You know, as soon as we installed it, I came back the next day and she just had filled it all already and was using it. So that was really cool to see. We did a bunch of work on her house, like replace the electric, replace plumbing, new roof, but she was most excited about her cabinets. So that was cool. So we went back to the drawing board and said, okay, how can we improve this? Actually worked with my brother a lot, and he came up with a mock-up for how we can, we took that first iteration and we just said, we need to clean it up. So we changed from the bottom shelves being wood to expanded metal. We changed to using some angle iron on the top, which you'll see, just to try to hide the edges. And use cement board on top instead of wood, just to make it a little bit more resilient, and we shrink the tubing a little bit. It makes it lighter, and the aesthetic, I think, was a little bit better. And that increased the cost now to $200. So you're looking at double the cost of off the shelf at a big box store, but yeah, the benefits far outweigh. And that's still, even for us as a nonprofit, that's still in the striking range of like, I can find a way to get that into my budget, because it's not $8,000 worth. Like, we're doing 15 feet of cabinets. We're not doing a massive installation. So, $3,000 worth of cabinets is something we can work with. So here's some of the specs for the second iteration. Here's it being fabricated at TXRX at David's studio. You can see the adjustable feet here. You can see the expanded metal lower. You can see a lot cleaner finish with the drawer slides and drawers, and then the angle iron up here so that we can just slide in the tile countertop and not have to look at the edge of it. Here's the, David just put together this piece, and then we had a contractor put together kind of mirror that design. So that's under construction. And then, apologize for the not great photo quality, but you can see it's all been painted now. We did a poplar, really nice hardwood finish on the drawers. And you can see some pretty nice tile there on top, and we hid the edge there and stuff like that. And there's the next round with the sink location. Looks okay. Yeah. So I think that came out. I think that came out pretty well. I think it a marked improvement from the first one, and we're going to start on the third iteration. We just scoped it, and we'll see what we can do on the third.
What's your counter material?
Tile with a cement board under it. Okay, so we're still working out the kinks on this. What about the wall behind it? Is there anything we've been trying to find, like a vinyl wainscoting or something that can be cleaned or washed or something like that? Best type of materials to use for the drawers. We're still trying to figure that out. So if anyone has ideas, this is a very iterative process, and we're definitely open to feedback and things like that. So, any questions on the cabinets? Cool. Yeah.
In that final picture of the whole kitchen assembled like that, the black looks pretty good, but I think in some instances, white shelves would be better. Does that stuff come in white?
We can spray paint it any color. Yeah, it has to be painted to be more resilient anyway, so it won't rust. So any colors.
They have powder coat ability at TXRX, don't they?
They do, but I don't think for that size. Yeah, it would be for smaller objects.
Yeah. And Steve brought up a point about what about the inside of the tubing? What if water gets in there? We're looking at, can we just spray paint in there? We'll have to see. I saw a design recently that just used angle iron for the whole construction. That would be a way to do that.
Probably cheaper too.
In the back,
Is the steel framing powder coated?
it's not.
What
It's
did
not.
you use to finish it, epoxy or just a standard paint, what did you use?
What is it, paint thinner to, how do you prime
Yeah,
it?
it's a paint thinner to clean it,
To
but
clean
then just like a Rust-Oleum type, so an enamel.
Yeah, an enamel that's just sprayed on.
Specific for metal,
Yeah,
sprayed with a can or with a
just
brick?
with a can. Yep.
Yeah. For decades, they had those steel cabinets, from the, I don't know, the 30s, 40s or something like that. And they did last a long time, but they do eventually rust.
Eventually rust, right.
Yeah.
But we're looking at those composite ones, 3 months, a little drip. I think we'll at least get 10, 15, 20 years out of these.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then I told you about that Sheila Blake's working on a project. She's going to fill her wall cavities with foam cement. And
Yeah.
it will be the finish as well.
Hmm.
So a waterproof and insulation and from about 4 feet down.
Maybe we could talk to her.
She bought a machine to do it.
Have you considered galvanized steel without any paint finish?
She's sitting right behind you.
I haven't. No, only because of concerns of welding with galvanized steel. So.
I think it's more toxic for
And
And I think the look of
galvanized
the-
material will also still rust if you get body oils or all kinds of food stuff will cause it. I live with a lot of galvanized in my house.
Yeah.
So I've been living with it for about 8 or 9 years. Some things, that get touched more often, they do turn, or, there's issues. I still love it, but it's not the perfect thing. And it could be like an alcohol or something to strip it and then seal it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's certainly, just like anything, may require a certain amount of maintenance along the way. Okay. How are we doing on the times?
Doing great.
Okay. Okay, so rain gardens. How familiar are people with rain gardens? Fairly familiar? Yeah, it looks a bit like very.
There you are.
So maybe I'll just.
You're next.
Maybe I'll just talk about it pretty briefly. that it isn't really a solution for flooding per se, but for a medium to heavy sized downpour that doesn't get up to very much, it can help just keep water away from the house, and we've already seen that. There was a storm a couple of weeks ago where there was like hail and a bunch of rain overnight. There was at least rain or hail in Lakewood, like baseball size, broke a bunch of people's windows and siding. And the water collected pretty fast too, and we've done maybe 4 or 5 rain guards, and I called the families, and then I kept the water in the drainage ditches and in the rain garden pretty well. I also got the chance to meet with that guy, Hank Ovink, from the Netherlands, who's like the international flood czar or whatever. I actually got to give him a tour of Northeast Houston, and he got to visit a lot of these families and see a lot of the sites, and I was like, rain gardens, what's up? Is this the jam? And he's like, no. He was like, yeah, it's great in small scale, but he's like, Houston really has to think at a very large scale how to mitigate floodwater. We took them to the, over off Homestead, there's a new retention pond going in. And he's like, that's really cute, it needs to be 40 times larger. And then, he shows his presentation at RDA that night, and they just did, massive scale flood mitigation and really widened the riverway. And it doesn't seem like there's quite the same willingness in Houston for people to come together for that. One thing I think that was an interesting takeaway from his feedback was that to get to that scale of buy-in, that it's a 10-year engagement process, actual engagement process where you have stakeholders, you have experts, you have residents all at the same table looking at the facts together and creating a solution together. And that's what it took to get to where they are. It's not just experts saying this is what we have to do. It has to be hand in hand with the residents. And I would say that's been our experience in our neighborhood too. To do anything successful, we have to do it with the people we're affected by it.
They'll widen our freeways, but not widen our.
Yeah, they're trying to expand I-45,
Yeah, and demolish all kinds of.
Everything.
Yeah, we have the climate
Action plan.
action plan. We have this big mayoral climate action plan that's supposed to, put us on the forefront and put us climate neutral or carbon neutral by 2050, and then we turn around and sign up for I-45 to come through and get expanded. It's like
And the Grand Park.
they're not very serious about it.
And the fracking.
And fracking. So for us, I guess what's interesting is that we get a lot of volunteers, or maybe you're a part of a group that has volunteers, and some people like digging. And so you can do this in about 2 days, and a lot of times we have really low skill volunteers who are just coming in and just like, wow, I want to help. It's like, do you know how to hang sheetrock? And they're like, no. It's like, okay, great, here's a shovel. Dig a hole. And so this was the first one we did for Mrs. White. She was very particular about her yard, so it was kind of the scariest place to do her first one. But she looked up on herself online photos of rain gardens and was like, wow, they look great, I really want one. So we put it in for her. She's taken very good care of it. This was it right at the beginning. You can see similar plants to Ryan's presentation with the Turk's cap. We've got some lemongrass and pentas and lilies and Chinese buttonbush. So yeah, water-loving plants and things. And so far for these residents, they've enjoyed having a little extra greenery, and it seems to, in those smaller storms, be pushing water away. So I think we've done maybe 5 or 6 now. That's another one. This is the most recent one that had a banana patch already in the middle of the yard, and so we put it elevated. All the soil we dug out from the rain garden went into the back. And so this was maybe a 250 square foot rain garden with a banana patch in the middle. So, and I think those bananas are just going to thrive with that extra water coming their way. We've added some Texas star hibiscus, native hibiscus, that have been a pretty nice plant to put in there as well.
How long ago did you plant the first one?
It's coming up on a year. Yeah, it is a year, last April.
If they take care of the rest of their lawn right, it will take in more water too.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so the first one we put in, she watered it all the time. I was like, you don't have to water it. The native plants, but she wanted to water it. The plants got huge, and then she's like, the plants are huge. And I'm like, no, you watered it all the time. And then winter came, and they all, like, the Turk's cap died back, and the lemongrass was looking scraggly, so she just cut everything back. And I was like, oh no, I hope she didn't cut them back too much. But they came back the next year, and they're still looking good. She's still really enthusiastic about it. A lot of some of these other families are less engaged, and so it's been interesting to see how those perform as well. But it seems like the native plants are doing well enough to take care of themselves. This is the first one I did myself for my mom's neighbor. It has a pawpaw tree in it. Pretty nice. But that helped keep the water off for the neighbor, so she was enthusiastic. Kind of hard to see that, but yeah, that's the most recent one. A little dark image. Yeah, they had some type of, it was no, there was I don't remember the name of it now. There was like a root vegetable that was just growing randomly in the yard, so we dug it up and put it in there. Okay, so this is the other interesting one I wanted to show, which we're calling the muck-ready wall. And so if you have sheetrock in a house, as you probably know, if it floods, you've got the toxic water touching the sheetrock, and then, so it's toxic and it's wet, and so the sheetrock really maintains that moisture. The insulation can maintain that moisture, but we've seen, and through the presentation that was here, they really show that the insulation doesn't really wick the water up that much, but the sheetrock really can, like in a big way, send water, moisture, and mold up the wall. So we wanted to, I've hung a lot of sheetrock now, and I prefer to not have to hang a lot of sheetrock in the future, and don't want to send as much to landfill. So in these instances where we're working with families who can't elevate, there's not a buyout coming anytime soon, there's not a lot of money for rebuilding, and even with us, with our rebuild money, we're probably only going to get one go at it. What's something that can make it a little bit better for the next time? So we did these things. This is all the text of it, but let's just look at it. So David and I were having a beer and came up with this. And then someone sent me a link to the FEMA document, which I've looked at 100 times, but somehow never saw this spec in it. Or maybe it just registered and I didn't realize it, but they have a similar design to what we were looking at, where you're trying to separate the bottom piece of sheetrock from the top. And you'll notice in their design that they have their chair rail that sits on top of the sheetrock. We actually put our chair rail in between. They're actually, I would love to find out how to contact the people who put this together if you have any contacts, because I have lots of questions. They have all of the sheetrock like off the wall. They have like extra pieces of wood to put it off. They're using closed cell insulation on the bottom, some type of replaceable or cleanable wainscoting on the bottom. I'm like, what did they use? Like, tell me more. So anyhow, we had a similar design that, again, David put together at TXRX. So we built out this little prototype, stuck it in water to see how it performed. And it seemed like it again showed what we thought, that the water will wick up through the sheetrock but not through the insulation. So then we're like, okay, let's see if we have a family who wants to try it. Mr. Doucette was like, let's do it. So first thing we do is we separate the insulation. And we were going to use wood for it, which was in the last design, but we ended up just using a piece of Tyvek. Because if the water's not really going to wick up through the insulation, we don't have to have like a really hardy barrier. And it's actually easier for volunteers or anyone just to like staple a little piece of Tyvek. So what is this doing and why do we care? So in our instance, when unskilled people were coming in to do good works and muck a house, I even remember having the same thought, how much insulation do I take out? They just grab the full 8-sheet piece and just rip it out. And it's like, wow, we could have used the top 4 feet of that, 6 feet of that, I don't know. It's like, but if you're just like, wow, you see mold everywhere, you're just taking everything out. So this design is trying to make it very clear to whoever's coming in that there's a separation here, They're like, wow, why is that? And maybe long enough to think about, okay, maybe this top part didn't get wet. And we're talking about like trying to leave instructions in the electric boxes at these houses. But the families themselves are very familiar with the design, so hopefully they're at the house when the house gets cleaned out, and they can communicate this. But anyhow, this part is designed to keep the top 4 feet of insulation in the wall. Again, very low-tech solutions, but seems kind of effective. And then the other weird thing we do is we start, instead of, most sheetrock is hung like ceiling first, then top of the wall, then bottom of the wall. It holds the top piece up. Lots of reasons to do it. But in this instance, if we get a small flood, or for lots of reasons, we decided to put a 1x6 piece of common board pine just on the base. So if it gets a little bit of water, we could remove that and replace it if it gets damaged or if it's not damaged. Because we ended up treating a lot of these with like kills and painting them to seal them a bit. So if the water doesn't appear to have damaged it too much, we can just leave for a small water event. We could just leave that right in place.
In fencing, that's a rot rail.
I'm sorry?
In fencing, that's a rot rail.
A rot rail.
Yeah.
Yeah, like meant to be removed.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's fine because then we wouldn't have to replace any sheetrock and do any repainting or any texturing. Much easier to replace a piece of wood, in my experience, than it is to replace a piece of sheetrock. Or at least a common board that's like $6 for 12 feet of it.
But in a flood, the sill plate behind it will get soaked. So that has to be dried out or treated with bleach or something so that it doesn't build up mold.
Absolutely, absolutely. So there's some interesting nuance there because a lot of these houses on their slab on grade are getting moisture from under the slab all the time. So we've tried to dry out seal plates and have had very little success because they always are re-wetting. But more generally, to your point, yes, we would want to, if it was an actual flood, we would want to pop that off, clean it, dry it, and put it back on or attach a new one.
You want to remediate the mold.
Remediate the mold, absolutely. So we attach this 1x6 on the bottom, and then we set our 4 feet of insulation. There's us actually priming the boards for the second room we did. But you can see we have our 1x6 here, then we set a piece of sheetrock, a full sheet. So it doesn't have to be cut or sized or anything. This is the full sheet of sheetrock. And it is actually pretty easy for volunteers or anyone to set the board. Having that little baseboard already attached to the wall makes it really easy to set the sheetrock on top of that. And then you just cut out your outlet holes, or in some designs, you're probably just going to move the outlet hole above that. So there's even less work to do to replace this bottom piece. And so basically, if there's water anywhere to maybe like 2 or 3 feet, I think FEMA recommends you would want to cut the sheetrock 2 feet above the flow water. So let's say 6 inches plus 2 feet, so 2.5 feet or less, we could just replace this bottom piece of sheetrock and that baseboard. And yes, take it out, take the insulation out, dry it, clean it, mold remediate, and just replace those pieces. And that'll be a much, if this board somehow gets saved, like if you pull off that sheetrock, you could still put a fan there, you could still treat if that bottom piece is in good shape, and you could just pop a piece of sheetrock right back in there. So much easier to do and much, much faster. Yeah.
Is green board any more flood resistant?
It like slows the process of molding, but it's still gonna mold. And the toxins on it, you're gonna want to remove it anyway. It just buys you a little bit of time. So you can see that so it's 1x6 on the bottom, 4 feet of sheetrock. We have a 1x2 here in the middle that's sitting on the studs, and then we set another piece of sheetrock on top. If you're doing the math, that means this is no longer a 4x8 piece of sheetrock. So it did produce some waste in the process of creating this. We're having to cut 10 inches of sheetrock off the top of each board. Not ideal, we're thinking about that, but it does hopefully mean that this top piece, doesn't ever have to be replaced.
So you put the ceiling in last?
Put the ceiling in. It's ceiling first, then the bottom piece, and then we put this top piece as the last piece, which ends up being the most difficult
It's gotta be cut.
Because it's gotta be cut, but this piece is set, we set this piece level, so it's really easy to install the bottom piece.
And so
Describe that whole-
and if it's uneven too, then that means, you
Yeah.
know, because you're dealing with existing construction.
Yes, and their existing structures, they're uneven, and so what we did here was, we just put a little piece of, we used the other side of this rip cut for the middle, and we put it on the top, and that covered the gap, so when we had an awkward cut by a brand new volunteer, covered by a piece of wood, we're good to go. So we simplified our door framing and window framing as well to try to match some of the aesthetic of this wood. And this is the main room in the first house we did with this with primer everywhere. So it's also, we want to prime all the wood and all the wall, so that was a pretty easy step. And then this is it at the end result. Some things to note here, you can see the 1x6, and again, existing houses are not level. So when we set that 1x6 level on the floor, then there's a gap between that 1x6 and the floor, so we had to add another piece of wood on the bottom, but it was still easier, it still felt easier than just attaching baseboard at the end and having to cut corners and stuff like that. I thought the trim in the middle came out super nice. And then you can see our using curtains instead of a composite door right there. Those composite doors just get mold so fast. And if, not that that they're going to be concerned about their curtains when they're leaving a flooded house, but they could just pick up the curtain and put it on the rod and save it. Those rods came from the galvanized gas piping in the house, so they got reused. My mom sewed the curtains. My brother fabricated it, and you got a closet curtain. In this, there's a lot you can say about the build out of this, but having this door frame already in place early in the construction process just saves a lot of time down the road. It takes more time at that moment, but it kind of simplifies the overall build out process. And you're not doing a complex door hanging exercise, and then you're in an unlevel house and you're having to attach it in weird ways. So those little types of tweaks can save us time and money, and we don't have to replace as much. There's a look at the living room with the same design.
Chair rail's a little high for chair rail.
Oh, yeah.
Needs a new name.
Oh, yeah, needs a new name, yeah.
Bar
right.
stool rail.
Bar stool rail.
In a shaker,
Ooh.
Really high.
So this was just a
I think they should put the
closer look at
chairs
the
up too.
curtains.
Like a shaker.
Yeah.
yeah, do a shaker.
And I think I'll skip the plumbing part.
But on the curtains, you could easily put like something in, that attaches inside the door frame.
Sure.
The Lee and Hardy Low House has all their door frames or for closets or have curtains on them, they're in the door frame rather than above it.
We used the same thing that they use in a hospital where they do the track in the ceiling, and you just hang it so that on the top, the head of your door jamb material, so
Yeah.
it's attached to that, and then it hangs there.
Oh, cool.
So that whole superstructure is just gone.
Right.
So all you get is the door frame itself.
Yeah, that'd be nice. Well, cool. So yeah, I was just gonna say I'm open to ideas and feedback, and if you wanna come out and volunteer as well, we're open to that. And yeah, just to reiterate that these are meant to be low-tech, low-cost solutions that make the house a little bit more flood resilient for the future. And hopefully these larger scale designs get in place so we don't have to do this as much. But we found these to be a little bit effective so far.
Yay.
All right.
Thank you, Andrew.
Question.
All right, any questions for our speaker? Yeah, Nancy.
Any interest from more conventional builders? I mean, other people's houses are flooding too.
So Johnny, who's our main contractor, does a lot of high-end or higher-end work on other parts of town. You know, he'll come and do a rebuild with us for $20,000 and then go to the other side of town and do it for $120,000. It's a bigger house and more expensive material, but he's starting to look like the metal cabinets. When I first talked to him, he was like, "This is ridiculous." And then he saw how the family reacted and was like, okay, maybe we could consider this. And he's having a similar reaction to the wall. And so he might start to integrate some of those practices into his. And I know I'm part of the rebuild organization scene in Houston, which is pretty large, SVP, Habitat for Humanity. So we have a monthly resilient design meeting, and we've been presenting these ideas, and those groups, Avenue CDC, Habitat, are interested in incorporating some of this. I know Baker Ripley, I gave this presentation right as they ran out of money from Harvey, and they were like, we would have used a lot of these as strategies if there is a similar type, if it requires a similar amount of skill and a similar amount of money.
How much does the rebuilding cost approximately per square foot?
For which design? For the flood cabinets, we're saying per linear foot, it's about $200. And then for a 1,400 square foot house, the muck-ready wall added maybe $1,500 in wood and paint.
Yes, sir.
Quick question on the 100-year floodplain concept. So I've had people argue this, and I've not looked it up, probably answer this. So 1% chance of flooding each year. So if I lived in a location in a 100-year floodplain for 10 years, does that accumulate to a 10% chance, or it's just strictly 1% each year?
Right.
And it doesn't pile up?
So if you have a 30-year mortgage, for example, there's a 26% chance that during that 30-year mortgage that you'll get at least a 100-year flood.
Okay, okay.
So we've had 3 500-year floods in the past 3 years.
So 500-year statistics is wrong.
Terminology is wrong.
Yeah. I mean, the idea of a floodplain in Houston is wrong. I mean, that whole terminology is wrong. The county is a floodplain.
Right.
Because we have a slope of 1 foot for every 5,280 feet.
Well, and the gray,
It's a floodplain.
the gray infrastructure makes it flood somewhere else.
And we get explosive rain. So Mike Talbot said years ago, he said everybody in Houston needs flood insurance.
I think they're pushing that, actually, like the county is trying to push for everyone in the county to, purchase flood insurance. There might be like different tiers of flood insurance based on where
There's
you are.
two different tiers.
Well, yeah, so.
Yeah, because over 50% of the damage claims that come in a certain period of time, I think since Allison, have been outside the floodplain.
Right, and there was a recent study by some colleagues of ours in Texas A&M. I think it's a paper from like 2013 or so. So basically they looked at floodplains nationally. So nationally, 20+% of the floodplains are outside of the 100-year floodplain. And for Harris County, it's double.
And we get these explosive events, plus you have the heat of climate change heating the
And I'm not even talking about, like storm surge or hurricane rainfall that we got from Ike, for example.
Allison.
Since permeability of the soil is so important between homes, why does the city of Houston give permits for single-family homes spaced about 3 feet apart?
That's a good question for them. In the permit process.
That distance is a firewall.
Sorry?
That distance is a firewall rule. It has nothing to do
No,
with
but
soil.
you should leave more space between for the water.
The city
to be-
actually has rules about the percentage of pervious cover per lot that takes that into account.
Well, apparently it's a lot.
There's something I know.
All right, well, no more questions. That's our program for tonight. I'm glad you could come out. And next month, we're going to be in touring, one of the high rise.
No, about to though. I think I might have met him at
He did that.